Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video. All right, it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Please make sure your microphones are muted. Good morning and welcome. Today, our class is on pruning and tree care. Our presenter is Christine Huseman, who is a certified arborist and a Master Gardener volunteer here in Prince William, as well as a horticulture analyst for Loudoun County. Christine is going to start off with a presentation, and then she's going to do a demo via video, and then we'll take your questions. So with that, Christine, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thanks for the introduction, Thomas. Good morning, everybody. Just going to keep it straight and simple through the presentation and as much as I can so we can get to questions. Let's start off with the benefits of trees. Trees do provide a variety of benefits, including improving air and water quality, preventing erosion, wildlife benefits in terms of food and habitats. They reduce human stress. This has been proven through studies. They lower energy costs. They can improve your property value, and they also provide carbon sequestration. This is a beautiful, actually woody perennial, not a tree. This is mountain laurel. If you guys ever do any hiking in the area, you probably see this. Hopefully, I'm going to be planting some in my yard this year. So as long as we're on the topic of woody perennials versus trees versus bushes. Trees are woody perennials that have one main stem or trunk that goes at least 4.5 feet above the ground and then splits out into branches, might actually become codominant at that point, but at least one single trunk up to 4.5 feet from the ground. Woody perennials or bushes are multi-stemmed, and they start breaking or splitting apart below 4.5 feet in height. Trees can take bush form, and bushes can be trained to grow in a tree form. It depends on what you're doing and what your goals are. How does a tree grow? A tree, does it grow just straight up from the ground with the branches getting a little higher every year, or does it add growth from the ends of the stems so branches are always on the same place in the tree? The answer is both. It actually does grow up from apical growth, so it grows straight up, and it gives you the vision that your branches are getting a little higher every year, but it does also produce additional branches later on from higher points. It also grows in what is called secondary growth in terms of the diameter of the trunk. It is going to expand and get larger over time. Trees will always grow towards the light. They're always going to try and grow upright towards that sunlight. Sometimes if they are understory trees in a forest, you'll see them growing out, trying to reach out from underneath that top layer story, the higher elevation trees. If you're driving around Virginia, you'll see this with a lot of red buds along wood edges. They're trying to get out there and get to that light, even though they are an understory tree. Forest trees tend to grow up more than open grown trees or field grown trees. They will, whereas a field grown tree will have a natural shape to it. Some of the forest ones are going to grow really tall in order to get to that light and then start filling out. Basically, they're going to try and fill in any available space that receives sunlight. Sometimes that can cause structural problems. And some of the pruning that we're going to talk about will help you address those structural issues. Tree biology, basic biology. Tree grows from the cambium layer, which is between the bark and the wood. The cambium forms both xylem and phloem. These are, layers that are utilized by the tree to move water and food from the roots up to the leaves and back down again, depending on the time of season, depending on what their nutritional needs are. Inside of the live xylem is older wood or heartwood of the tree. The heartwood is no longer living. It provides the stability and the strength within the tree. Outside of the live phloem is the bark, which also no longer living provides protection for the tree. It's its outer barrier. This is a good example. I'm sorry, I don't have a laser pointer option quite set up, but you can see in the center, there's the heartwood, and then you see the sapwood. The sapwood's going to be a little bit lighter, and in between the old heartwood and the new sapwood, you can see on trees, that's where you'll start seeing those rings that people like to count. And then you see the vascular cambium, which creates your living phloem. And then the cork cambium, which is really part of the bark. It's the exterior piece. There are two kinds of growth within a tree, primary or apical growth, which I mentioned earlier. This comes from the buds at the end of your stems. Or apical meristems. It grows long and adds height and spread to your crown. It's what allows your branches to continue to grow out each year and to add growth to the top of the tree. Your secondary or lateral growth is coming from that cambium, and that's your lateral meristem, and that's what causes the tree to grow thicker all the way around. Also developing that stability, it's protecting that inner heartwood and sapwood layers. Apical growth is fast, vigorous growth. You can see it happening almost every year. It doesn't last forever, though. It's something that is generally in the early stages to, say, just to maturity on a tree. Once the tree or shrub reaches that mature size, the apical growth slows down significantly because the tree is no longer trying to become larger. It is trying to maintain its stability. It's only going to really replace lost branches or damaged parts of the tree going forward. That's why as you start looking at your older, more mature trees, you don't necessarily want to do any heavy pruning because all the energy is being used differently. The energy to wall off and protect those wounds that we create when we prune something is also diminished as on a more mature tree. That's why you want to do things like structural pruning young, so that you can help develop a good structure for the tree so that hopefully you don't have to do too much pruning later on in life. Lateral growth is dependent on rainfall, the amount of sunlight, the health of the plant. It occurs all over, just underneath the bark. So you're going to see it within the trunk as it expands over the years. You're going to see it in the branches as they get larger as well. There are two main tree growth forms. There's excurrent, which is your upright tree. If you think about your oaks and your evergreens, they tend to have a strong central leader. It's a straight trunk all the way up to the top of the tree. Your branches are about half the size of the trunk or less, and it's got a strong pyramidal shape in terms of your excurrent trees. Your decurrent tree is going to be more of your rounded tree. Think about your maples. They tend to have more of that shape. The trunk branches in the crown, several main stems with smaller branches. So you'll see once it gets to hopefully that 4.5 foot mark, it's going to then branch out into multiple leads with branches coming off of each one of those leads. This picture shows actually both of those trees. If you look on the right-hand side of the frame, that is your excurrent tree, and the one immediately next to it is more of your decurrent. And this is just from the opposite side, same trees. So now that your excurrent tree is on the left and your decurrent is on the right. Growth can cause problems in trees, epicormic growth or poor attachment. It can cause bad crotch shape, V-shaped versus U-shaped. Those really tight crotches can lead to what is called codominance and included bark. It makes the tree much more brittle, or the branch much more brittle and easier to break, because that bark branch ridge and collar can't form quite as well. Those really are designed to help the stability of the branch. Another form of poor structure is rubbing or competing branches. They tend to push each other out of the way and cause difficulty for the tree overall, as it fights itself to get to that light and find that happy place. Adventitious buds are apical meristems that are kind of hidden in the cambium. So they tend to lay dormant until growth is triggered. So over this last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of snow and ice. A lot of people have probably seen broken branches off of trees in their own backyards. When those branches break and you remove that damaged wood, these apical meristems that are just underneath the cambium are going to fire up to try and replace that particular branch. Sometimes it can result in water sprouts, which is a lot of little ones. You're going to want to work on pruning those to find the best one that's going to have the strongest growth pattern, and hopefully not too tight of a structure. Some species will produce these from the roots, but it can happen all over the tree. And some species, they just try to do this throughout their life. You kind of need to keep an eye on it and watch as they go. And because as these epicormic branches grow, as I've noted, they're going to be fast growing, but it's often weak wood that is weakly attached because it doesn't have that proper branch collar structure. This is a really great example of what those adventitious buds look like. You can see the 4 new buds that have sprouted into what look like they could be a nice big branch at some point, but because they are so tight up against that tree and so tightly packed together, they are going to struggle, they're going to be weak, and ultimately they are likely to fail. Those were developed because of the pruning cut that was made, as you can see, just behind all 4 of them. You can see there was a pruning cut at some point, and that's what generated those to start coming out. You can also see that there's a little tiny one coming out just in the left bottom corner of that picture. You're probably better off trying to train that to be that new branch and eliminate those really tight, straight up ones that we see in the foreground of this picture. Branch attachment. Branches normally extend into the trunk. Kind of think of them like a cantilever. Basically, if this is your trunk and this is your branch, inside there, the collar and the branch bark ridge are all helping that stability. As the epicormic branches come out, though, they tend to be really tight and straight up. They don't have that flexibility. So they're just weaker, they're not attached well. Even regular branches can come out that way. This is part of why you want to do structure pruning. You want to try and shoot for that optimum angle of between 45 and 60 degrees from the trunk. It's not always possible, and in some species, it's not a standard. So it's really important to know exactly what species you're dealing with and what its growth habits are and what it will tolerate in terms of pruning and adjustment. Oh, sorry, went a little too fast there. Crotch shape. Crotch is where 2 parts of the tree or the bush come together, a twig and a branch and a trunk, or 2 trunks. A V-shaped crotch, as we mentioned earlier, is bad because the bark gets caught up in between there at that union, and it's called included bark. And basically, as it's growing, it's trying to generate that branch bark ridge and collar, and it has nowhere to go. So it just keeps pushing up and up and up, and you get development inside there that's very weak and easy to break apart. A U-shaped crotch is going to give a whole lot more breathing room, and you'll be able to see that nice, clean, pretty branch bark ridge or collar. In this picture, this is a very distinct V shape. Over time, this could become problematic depending on the species of the tree. Some are, they have inherently developed this way, so they may last for a while, but ultimately as that starts to create that included bark, it's going to become problematic, brittle, and in a good storm or a heavy snow, it could break apart pretty easily. This is a better example of your U-shaped trunk or your U-shaped juncture. And as you can see, it looks like a U in the base, and it's got it's got a very distinct little ridge in there, but it's not pushing up and out. It's just exactly where it should be, kind of flush with the tree, and it creates a beautiful branch bark ridge and collar. So codominant trees and included bark. A codominant tree is one that has two stems, and they're both acting like a central leader. They're growing at an even pace for the most part, and it just looks like, oh, this is a double-trunked tree. Sometimes it's not a horrible thing, but most times it's a bad idea to leave that way if you can catch it early enough and choose one of those two to become the central leader as part of structure pruning. It's going to be better for you. If you're purchasing a new tree, that's something you want to look at as you're purchasing it. The crotch angle is going to be incredibly narrow, that V almost invisible in some cases, and it is a structural weakness that will eventually lead to failure. You need to, again, it's something that can be controlled early on if you have a young tree, but a lot of times you're moving into an environment where that tree already exists, and it's something you're going to need to keep an eye on. This is, oh, sorry, went a little too far, too fast again. Oh no, I'm terribly sorry about that. There we go. My computer is doing fun things all on its own. Okay, so this is a great picture of what the inside of a codominant tree looks like, what that included bark does. You can see that as it was continuing to grow, it was creating bark inside that codominant split. And all it did was weaken the structure and allow it to split apart much easier when a storm came through. This was actually cut apart, for example, but after it was removed, but that's exactly what it would look like if you watch something break apart. Okay. All right, and this is kind of a good example of what you might see years after a codominant tree has split apart. It never quite heals properly. The codit principle will work as hard as it can within a tree to heal off a wound, but it struggles when a wound is ripped open and it takes away the bark ridge and collar. Or in this case, in a codominant, it just went straight down to the root structure. Back to the poor structure, additional things to watch out for are rubbing branches. Branches that touch all the time will always be touching. They're not going to grow away from each other, but they might grow around each other. They might even fuse together depending on the species, but it's a weak spot. It's not something that you want to have. You don't want to leave that behind. It's something you want to address as part of your pruning practice. Competing branches, they might not be touching yet, but you can see them if you have something that's a branch coming out and it's growing straight into another branch. Maybe they're not touching yet, but eventually there's going to be a conflict there that you're going to have to deal with. The codic principle, which I mentioned earlier, is the compartmentalization of decay in trees. This is something that was well studied by Alex Shigo, and he wrote about it and put this together. Woody plants can wall off decay and disease, including pruning cuts, if they are well made. Young plants do this very, very well, which is why you want to try and do as much corrective pruning as structural when the tree is young, as opposed to waiting until it's older, because the plants or trees lose their ability to wall off that decay, because when you're making a pruning cut, you are wounding a tree. And it takes a lot of energy for it to close that wound. There are 4 walls that it works with to do this, but they all need to work together. And that exterior wall is the most important one, where you see branches. I'll show you in a minute. There's some good pictures here that I can point out. As I said, there's 4 walls of defense. There's the growth from the previous year, which is from the inside. It's toward the center of the tree. There is the second wall, which is found within the wounded lines of the xylem and the phloem. So it's going up and down. There's also the third wall is the side to side, which is going to help prevent it from moving too far over. And the last wall, which is next year's growth, which is that exterior growth that you see covering over. And that is the strongest one. And that's the one you really want to make sure that you are cautious about when you're making that pruning cut. It needs to be a good, clean cut every time so that you're not damaging the branch bark ridge or collar, because that's what's going to create that last wall of defense. Oh, I'm sorry. I really thought there was a picture in there. I'm sure there's one that's coming up though. What is pruning anyway? When done incorrectly, pruning is just cutting things off of a plant or a tree. You could walk over to anything and go, here, I'm going to take off this and this. But you really need to kind of think it through. When done correctly, most of the process is defining objectives. It's deciding on the proper form, planning your cuts, maybe over several years, and then going in and actually making your cuts. Part of this, the defining objectives portion, this is where you really need to understand what species you're dealing with and what it will tolerate. Some plants, some woody perennials, you can cut them to the ground and they'll come right back the next year. Others, if you did that, you just killed your plant. So really important to know exactly what you're working on before you start making cuts. Here's an example of some not so great cuts. You don't want to be leaving stubs behind. If you follow the trunk of this tree, on the left-hand side as you're going up, you see 2 little stubs sticking out. Those are going to allow for pathogens, pests, disease to enter that tree, because the branch bark ridge and collar, which are at the juncture point of that branch and the trunk, is not going to be able to close over that stub. Here's a close-up view of that. Again, you can see that stub sticking out. The collar, the ridge is never going to be able to close around that. It can really only go over a nice flush cut, for lack of a better word to use. So the most common maintenance of trees and shrubs is pruning. There's a lot of other things that people will tell you can be done, but that's ultimately what pruning is the maintenance of trees and shrubs, and it is the thing that is done most frequently. You should always be thinking about what's going to be left behind. If you take off a large branch from a tree, what you're leaving behind might be unbalanced. It might be unattractive, but that's an aesthetic thing. You need to look at the overall scope, because you never really want to be taking more than 25% out of the crown of a tree at any time. That does not include dead wood or damaged wood. That's only live wood that you need to consider. And that's next comment. Of course, we should consider, what are we removing? Dead, dying, damaged, because we are going to be stuck with whatever's left for a really long time. So as you take things off, think about how it's going to regrow, what's going to happen. Again, know the species, what to expect. There are a number of different reasons for pruning. To correct growth issues, as we discussed, that's structural pruning. From a perspective of safety, in terms of if you have branches that are hanging out over a play set in your backyard, or if there's something that's over a sidewalk where there's a lot of heavy foot traffic. You want to make sure that those branches are healthy. If they are starting to deteriorate, you're going to want to remove them so they don't become a safety hazard. For providing clearance, perhaps, again, that same sidewalk, you want to be able to walk there without having to duck underneath your tree. Pruning for reducing shade and wind resistance, to influence flower or fruit production. To improve your view or aesthetics. A lot of people will do this. It's called vista pruning. If they want to be able to see the beautiful river that's out in the backyard somewhere, they might want to prune a couple of branches so that they have a clearer view of that. But again, you need to keep in mind what that's going to do to that tree, because it might not be in the best interest of the tree in the long run. The best thing that you can do, though, is to start early and encourage good structure in young trees so that they grow to the shape and form that they are predetermined or inclined to grow to. So what should we prune? The best rule of thumb is the 4 Ds. You want to prune out dead or dying branches. You want to remove diseased or decaying branches. You want to remove damaged or broken branches. These 3 things can be pruned out of a tree at any time of year. You actually should try and get them out as soon as you see them. Deranged, which is my favorite one, is the severely crossing or conflicting branches. Chances are when you're taking out those, it's going to be live growth. So you really need to make sure that you are timing it appropriately for the species of tree, and considering that removal as part of that 25% of the crown, because you don't want to remove more than that in a single growing season. This particular picture shows you some great ideas of all the different things that we've been talking about. You can see, if you follow around, starting from the lower right, the narrow weak crotch. The original branch that was there that they are going to prune out was very tight and into the tree. It was also conflicting with some of the branches farther up and would eventually have become a structural issue. Go ahead and take that one out. You can then look at the dead or broken branch. You're going to go ahead and get that out. The awkward or unattractive branch, that's going to be very much up to your opinion. Rubbing or crossed branches, as we're coming around to the top left of the image, you can see where that particular branch that it's pointing at was growing straight up into the next branch, and again, going to cause an issue down the line. Inadequate spacing is really, again, going to depend on your species and what it will tolerate. As you can see in that particular gap, those 2 branches were really tight together, and in order to help balance the tree and help give it the proper form, that was removed the lower of the two to allow that spacing. Water sprouts that were growing up, again, probably some type of damage, or maybe just suddenly there was some light coming into that particular space that hadn't been there before. So now you're getting a couple of water sprouts. Take those out early. Obviously, any suckers down at the bottom of the tree should also be removed. Again, when you're looking at your tree, you want to take out the dead, the diseased, the decayed wood first. Then go back in, actually step back, take a look and see what else should be removed. Maybe that's all you take out at any given time, is anything dead, diseased, or damaged. And then maybe the next year you see what has happened to it over the course of a season. And then you go in and start considering inadequate spacing or tight crotches. Ultimately, it comes back to knowing the species, what it will tolerate. When you're getting started with pruning, that first step in pruning is establishing your objectives and planning. Again, know your species, what it will tolerate. What species are you working with? Some species can handle a heavy pruning in early spring. Some species really need to be done over the winter and the dormant season to help minimize pests and pathogens getting in. Why are you cutting something off of your tree? Think about that before you make that first cut. What should be removed first? We've talked about that. Anything dead, decayed, damaged, those should be removed first. What should be saved for next year, or maybe even later? Again, that 25% rule really comes into play there. Once you've removed dead, decaying, and diseased, no more than 25% of live wood should be removed in one season. So maybe you're trying to thin out something for light and air to be able to penetrate and create better growth structure for, say, a boxwood. You don't want to take out too much in that first season. It could be detrimental to the tree or to the bush in that case. A great way to see that is once you've taken out the dead, dispose of it. As you start taking out live wood, keep your pile of debris next to your bush or your tree, and then you can look at both and decide, have I taken 25% of that crown out of there? And that can be your judgment on when to stop. So the risk analysis, the reality is we are cutting things off of trees. We are leaving a wound. Insects, disease, pests, pathogens can get into that tree. And depending on the age of the tree, how good your cut was, it may not heal properly. So that may be an opened wound for a really long time. Things that to consider as you're getting ready to make those first cuts. There are valid reasons for cutting things off of trees, but you do need to make sure that the tree is going to be healthy enough to withstand that. Again, how to deal with your trees. Take a moment, think about, are they big trees, little trees? Just because it's a big tree doesn't actually mean it's an old tree. Some trees are very fast growing. So knowing how long that tree has been there is going to be a good gauge. I moved into my house. I had a large Norway spruce in my front yard, and I considered it pretty big at the time, but it was actually still pretty young, and it's finally reaching maturity now, about 20 years after I've moved in. So things to consider. Not always something you're going to know if you've moved into a new environment, but hopefully you can get a good gauge on it. And here's a great question. Do you feel comfortable climbing to or reaching up to where the problem is to make that good pruning cut? If you're not confident, if you are not going to be reaching it from a safe place. If you have to stand on something to get there, maybe you need to call in a professional, a certified arborist, to handle that for you rather than taking the risk yourself. Large mature trees should be pruned by a certified arborist. That's just the best way to go after them. We're talking, your larger trees in your yard, that Norway spruce. At this point, over the years, I've taken off a few of the lower branches to create some clearance for cars to get past. But anything that at this point, if I needed anything done, I would be calling in a certified arborist other than myself, an actual climbing arborist who has the right equipment and the safety tools at their ready to be able to do that work. I have good equipment, but not to be able to do things at height because I don't climb. Trees weigh an enormous amount. Even limbs and branches, you'd be quite surprised. And you don't want to underestimate what's going to happen. And one of the things that we've talked about in this industry for a long time is what are words that you would use to describe the tree care industry? And the best one that has come out, and it's consistent every year, is unpredictable, because we never 100% know what's going to happen when we make a cut on a tree, because you can't see inside of it, and there might be more going on than you realize. So just use caution. And if you have any doubts in your abilities, call a certified arborist. Remember, mature trees grow more slowly and they use more energy just to maintain themselves. They have fewer defenses against insects and diseases, so they can't handle a severe pruning. And a certified arborist is going to be able to help you judge how much of it can be done in any 1 year. Pruning on a large mature tree should really only fix major problems, dead or damaged wood. You don't really want to be going into a large mature tree and deciding that now is the time to vista prune it, because you want to be able to see something. It's probably not going to be in the best interest of the tree. Small young trees, it's much easier to deal with problems when they are small, like those codominant stems, branch structures, crossing branches. Dead and dying wood is easily replaced by the tree, and by doing structure pruning and watching as the trees are young, it's going to prevent them from becoming unfixable issues once the tree is large. A tree is young and relatively small, you can kind of do it for yourself. Once it gets too mature, it gets to that point where you can't necessarily reach. Small old trees, we referenced this before. Beware of the old small trees. A lot of your ornamental trees, they don't get very big. And despite the fact that they might not seem like they are fully mature, they are. And if you go in there and you prune them with the idea that they're still in growth mode, you can do a lot of damage. You can do some form correction, but it will take longer for it to heal. And you just want to balance that out. I've got a dogwood in my front yard that is reaching its life expectancy at this point. And while there are some things that I would like to maybe change, I'm not touching that, because I take off dead wood only, because I know that it can't handle anything more than that, and it's only going to open it up to things like anthracnose. When is the right time to prune? Again, dead wood, damaged wood, diseased wood can be removed at any time with little or no harm to the tree. Diseased parts should be removed as soon as they are noticed. Depending on the type of disease, will dictate your pruning cut, whether or not you take it all the way back to the trunk, maybe just past the portion of disease that's visible. Again, you need to identify your species of tree and identify what the disease or the problem is so that you know exactly what you're up against. Trees that flower on old wood should be pruned right after flowering. So your mock orange that's in my front yard or off the side of my house, I prune that every year after it finishes blooming. It blooms from late May to early June. Seems like an odd time to suddenly decide to prune a tree in June. Most people would be like, oh, that's totally wrong. But that tree will bloom off of the old growth or flower off of that old wood. So it's not going to impact it quite as much. Whereas if I were to do the same thing to a crepe myrtle, which blooms off of new growth, it could be very harmful to that tree. Most trees should be pruned in late winter or very early spring, just before the buds begin to swell. The worst time to prune a tree is probably during that first flush of growth, after the buds start to open and before full leaf expansion. Again, know your species and what it will tolerate. Here we go. Pruning right after that first flush of growth can really limit the growth and health of a tree. It's probably the worst time to prune. Again, know your species before you make that decision. Pruning in the fall when trees are getting ready to go into that dormant phase can also be problematic. Good rule of thumb here in this area, that being Mid-Atlantic, Northern Virginia, you want to prune after Christmas, before the beginning of April, although keep in mind that weather is a factor too over the winter. These recent patterns we've had this January, today itself, it's below freezing. It's not going to get above freezing. You really don't want to open up wounds at that time when it's going to stay frozen, because that's not going to give the tree the time it needs to start repairing itself and generating that wound wood. Ideally, late winter, early spring between February 14th and March 15th is a great time, depending on the species. Please make sure you know that before you make any cuts. Is your tree healthy enough to prune? Twig extension is the best indicator of tree growth. You can see look at the twigs on the entire crown of the tree. How much has it grown in the past few years? Are you still seeing new growth, growth in between the nodes of the branch year after year? If you're not seeing that, or if they're shortening, if those internodes are getting smaller and smaller, then it might be time to start easing off. Healthy trees, as I said, can be pruned up to 25% in any one growing season. Less healthy trees should be pruned more lightly and maybe just have the dead or diseased or damaged wood removed. Good rules of thumb: don't cut off a stem that's more than 3 inches in diameter. Anything larger than that probably should be dealt with by a certified arborist, because you're starting to get into that large open wound, might be aging tree. Don't cut off more than 25% of the crown. Again, that doesn't include dead wood, but anything else that you're taking off, yes, it's live wood in some way, shape, or form, so consider it. Diseased and damaged wood, they have to come off. Just keep in mind, if you take off 15% of the crown as damaged wood because of a storm that just came through, you don't want to go in and then take off another 25%. Leave everything on the ground like we talked about. Keep the dead wood separate so that you're not counting that as part of your 25%, but that pile allows you a good gauge. Workplace safety. Safety is paramount when you are working with trees. You need to be wearing eye protection always, especially if you are using any type of a saw, even a hand saw. You'd be amazed at how quickly the wind can catch a piece of sawdust and stick it right in your eye. Gloves are also important to protect your hands and improve your grip. You want to keep your tools sharp. Sharp tools will cut cleanly and with less effort. It makes a better cut along the tree. It's easier for it to heal. Dull tools require more work and more effort, and you're far more likely to have an accident that way. If you are considering using a chainsaw, make sure that you have ear protection and a hard hat with a face shield, and protective chaps are absolutely necessary. Please keep in mind that if you are using a chainsaw, be very considerate of what you're doing. Make sure that you're comfortable using it. They are incredibly dangerous tools, and you need to give them the respect that they deserve. Hand pruners work very well for small stems. Any stem that is larger than your pinky should not be cut with hand pruners. You want to take the next step up and either move into compounds or to a pruning saw. You can use compounds as long as they are that bypass style, same as your hand pruners. They should be that bypass style. You don't want the anvil style because that's going to crush your branch as you're making that cut, and it's going to damage and make it far more difficult for the tree to heal. Again, chainsaws, please be careful. Make sure that you're confident, that you know what you're doing, that you've got some experience with that. I don't want to see anybody getting hurt. And with any saw, watch out that you're only cutting the stem that you're trying to remove. Sometimes you need to really consider whether or not you can actually make the cut that you need to. Maybe that's not the branch to cut because you can't quite get in there and make a good clean cut either with a saw or with pruners. Hand pruners, again, nothing more than the size of your pinky. You want to make sure they're sharp and that they are the bypass style. You can see that these are being used just outside that branch, bark, ridge, or collar to take off this particular branch. Some of this will come up in the video that's going to be shown at the end. When you're making cuts, you always want to cut back close to the branch collar or reduce the branch with a 3-step or snap cut before you make that final cut at the branch, bark, ridge, and collar. Flush cuts that are flat to the trunk are definitely bad cuts. That branch, bark, ridge, and collar are what form your wound wood and close it over to protect it. So you don't want to damage that when you're making your cuts, and flush cuts will basically tear that right off the tree and leave an ugly opened wound. The branch collar, when a limb or stem stops providing enough food to the rest of the plant, a tree starts a shedding process. And a special ring of plant material forms around the junction of a limb and parent trunk. It's called the branch defense zone. And that's what's going to create that wound wood so that when you make your pruning cut, it's going to allow it to close over and limit any decay inside the tree. This picture is a great example of what a branch, bark, ridge, or collar looks like. You can see the rippling that's coming off the trunk. And right as it gets to that branch, it stops. And the branch almost sticks out from the center of that ridge, that collar. Your final cut should be outside of that ridge, outside of that collar, to protect the tree and allow it to close itself off. This particular cut, you can kind of see it was made a little bit too close to trunk. If you look, you can see that same rippling is starting across the top. You see the 3 little ridges. I would have made that cut outside of that last little ridge, just as it dips down. And if you look to the bottom, you can see there's almost a notch, a little inverted V, where that branch, bark, ridge, and collar is closing off on the bottom side. Again, I'm sorry I don't have a laser pointer to really be able to show you this. Some of the video has some good examples though. This is an example of actually a good wound that's healing over well, despite the sap, the bleeding that's coming from the tree. That's perfectly normal, but it is slowly closing over that wound. So the 3-cut method will be demonstrated in the video so that you can see what I'm talking about. But your first cut is going to be made through the branch part way, starting from underneath. You're going to go about 1/3 to halfway through the branch. You want to do this maybe 1 inch or 2 away from that branch collar. Your top cut is going to be made through the top of the branch, about 1 inch or 2 further out from that first undercut you made. And as you start to get halfway through, it's going to quickly just kind of snap right off, but it's only going to go as far back as that initial cut that you made underneath. And it's going to leave a little stub. You're going to go back in, and that's your final cut. Your 3rd cut in this 3-step method is going to be to cleanly cut away that stub just outside that branch collar. This is a good picture representation of that. Again, your first cut is from underneath. Your second cut is from the top. It will meet partway through the branch and make that branch come off nice and clean. The reason that we do this, if the branch has enough weight and you just start cutting from the top, it's going to rip through that branch collar as it starts to fall off the tree once the weight takes hold and pulls the branch down. You don't want to damage that branch collar, so this is why we're trying to prevent that from happening. Again, that final cut is going to be made just outside of your branch collar. As you can see, this is a great representation of what it looks like when it rips away. It has damaged the branch collar, and that is never going to heal properly. This is a picture of a really great pruning cut. You can see that the wound wood is starting to form just around the outside. It's slightly raised and almost a little bit green, like it's generating new fresh wood. It's a great cut, and it's slowly going to heal over. This is an example of a flesh cut. As you can see, it's not a healthy cut, and it has cut through the branch collar, both on the top and the bottom, and ultimately that's going to be very detrimental to that tree. Coat it works the exact same way on bushes or woody perennials. It's just on a smaller scale. Same concept, dead and diseased stems should still be removed at any time of year. Crossing stems and included bark will still cause a problem. Bushes may be pruned back a little bit more severely, but again, know your species, what it will tolerate. In summary, large and mature trees should be handled by professionals, certified arborists. It should be limited to fixing high-risk problems, removing dead and diseased stems. Pruning young trees can fix problems before they become major issues, and can be handled by a knowledgeable gardener like yourself. Always consider the natural form of the plant. Never remove more than 25% of the crown in a growing season, or stems larger than, branches larger than 3 inches in diameter. This is a little bit of a list of some good references for additional information. If you're looking for certified arborists, you can go to goodtreecare.com or treesaregood.org. These are both sponsored by the International Society of Arboriculture, and the MAC ISA is the local chapter. You can search for arborists based on your zip code. Some great books on additional information. And of course, you can always go to the Virginia Cooperative Extension for specific topics such as pruning and some specific species pruning like crepe myrtles. And that's it.
Well, thank you, Christine. So in the interest of time, just because I know there are a lot of questions here in the chat, the video is about 12 minutes. So what I think we should do is take questions, and then anybody who wants to hang on for the video can hang on and watch it. Otherwise, when we put this up on YouTube, the video will be tacked on. That will hopefully maximize the use of everybody's time, because I know some people probably need to go. So let me open up the chat here. Let's see where we're at. How do you prune a branch so close to the trunk?
I think we kind of covered that in terms of this 3-step process.
Can I amend that question a little bit?
Sure.
It's an ornamental cherry, and the branch is coming up rather, maybe a foot or two higher than the base, and it's vertical. So it's one of those branches that's so tight to the trunk. I'm not sure how to prune it because I don't want to leave a stub. I want to get it close. I certainly can't get a saw in between it and the trunk. So how do I do that and leave a nice,
Right. I totally understand what you're saying. My inclination without seeing it is going to be to tell you to start your initial cuts, do your snap cut method, start them far enough up that branch so that you can get in there. And maybe your final cut can be started from the bottom so that you're not trying to get in between the branch and the trunk. Does that make sense?
It sure does. So is that successful for you? That's what I was thinking.
It can be done that way. There's nothing wrong with that final cut being started from the bottom in order to accommodate what you need to do for the best interest of the tree.
Okay, thanks so much. It's my daughter's tree and I don't want to mess it up.
I get that. Yeah. All right. What else do we have?
When a branch breaks, is it best to prune the branch right below the break or prune it back to the trunk?
If there is a healthy lateral that you can prune back to, meaning there's a good, strong branch coming off of the main branch. It's so hard to use. There's not enough terms in the world. You could go back to that healthy lateral, but that is considered a heading cut. So you need to make it carefully. I'm going to tell you it's going to depend on the species first. Know what you're working with. It might be safer to take it back to the trunk so that it can heal itself off with the best of its ability.
Okay. What's the best way of pruning / dealing with crepe myrtles when they have multiple trunks that are clustered together?
Same thing. If you feel that you have to remove some of those trunks, I'm going to suggest that you start your first two of the 3-cut method far enough out that you can make good, clean cuts without damaging the other trunks around it. And then maybe make that final cut starting from the bottom up. You can also, if it truly is a completely separate trunk from the ground, you can take that cut all the way to the ground. I know they get really tight together. It's a challenge to prune a crepe myrtle. You might want to, depending on how much you value that tree, you might want to consult a certified arborist and let them make that call for you.
Okay, we have another crepe myrtle question, sort of. I know that topping trees is bad, but is it worse for some species than others? You know, crepe myrtles can be topped, but often they seem to recover.
The crepe myrtles that you see recovering from being topped are actually being done. It's called pollarding. It's a very specific form of pruning. And those initial cuts are made to create what is known as the knuckle. And then growth comes off of that knuckle each year. And you only cut back to that knuckle. It's something you need to be very careful with trying. In general, across the board, topping trees is bad always, because you are not making a healthy cut to a place where the tree has already been designed to heal itself as part of that coated principle. Again, know your species, what it can tolerate. There are reduction cuts that can be made to bring a crown down to a better size by selectively removing some of the longer pieces and doing it over a period of several years so that you're not taxing the tree's ability to heal itself or taking too much of the crown out at any one time.
Can I add on to that?
Sure.
So the reason I asked that question is, you know, crepe myrtles seem to be topped all over everywhere. I mean, the city tops them where they're planted on businesses and down streets. And I know it's bad for them as well, but I know crepe myrtles just on their own put out all these, I forget what you called them, but you know, offshoots.
Mm-hmm.
So crepe myrtles just seem to tend to be almost suited for that because they easily put off these offshoots anyway. But I realize it's still bad even for crepe myrtles. But the reason I brought it up is because of the snowstorm we had and all the branches that are breaking on all kinds of trees. I've started noticing tree companies, and I don't think they're arborists, and they're evidently talking homeowners into just totally topping every branch off different trees. So I drive around and I'm seeing maples and oaks. The Wawa down the street from me has these Kentucky coffee trees, and they just totally topped every limb off the whole tree. And I'm thinking, those kinds of trees, I'm thinking topping is probably really bad, worse than even like a crepe myrtle. Yeah. And that's why I was asking. It's just some trees I would think would be even really worse to top than even topping like a crepe myrtle. Is that
Agreed?
Right?
Agreed. It depends, again, on the species. You can be doing far more damage than you realize. And unfortunately, what you're saying is too common a practice. There are tree companies out there that are not certified arborists that will do that either because the client asked them to, because suddenly they freaked out because somebody had a branch break in a storm and land on their house next door, or any number of reasons. And it is a matter of, they could be convincing the homeowner or the business could be requesting it because they don't want to have to deal with a potential safety hazard. Unfortunately, it's a matter of education, and making sure that you're working with a professional who is going to be doing what is in the best interest of the tree, not just what seems to be the easiest.
Right. So I'm thinking these companies are talking the owners into it, but I think, tell me if this is right, but what I'm thinking is, so then even if the tree does put off new shoots,
Yep, adventitious
those new
growth.
shoots are going to be weaker. So if your worry is that your limbs are going to fall on your tree, well, this has made it even worse because now the new limbs are going to be even weaker than the ones you cut off, and they are going to tend to break off even worse.
Yes, 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 and yes. You are correct.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. What do we have? I've got some dead branches far up on a silver maple, which also has a severe crotch angle issue. Do I trim it in the winter or early spring?
For a silver maple, all maples, you're going to want to stay in late winter to early spring is really the best time to do that. Based on your description, if this is a larger tree and the deadwood is pretty high up, if you're not comfortable climbing that tree yourself, or I would definitely get a professional certified arborist in there. If you've got a major crotch weakness, which is unfortunately very common in silver maples, it might behoove you to, again, bring in a certified arborist to help you decide what's going to be in the best interest of that tree.
I know. We cut down the best one.
Okay, let's see. Have you noticed in your experience?
Cut down the better one. It was too close to the house.
Sorry. Have you noticed from your experience that native trees to Northern Virginia don't need pruning at all, or maybe not as much as they've evolved with our climate versus non-native invasive trees that haven't evolved in our climate?
I'm going to say that that's still going to depend on early growth and structure, setting up that structure as it's young. The native trees, they do tend to, obviously, they do better because, they're designed to be in this area. But I can't confidently say that they don't need any pruning or less pruning. It depends on right plant, right place. If you go back to your basic master gardener training, does it have a restricted root area that's causing it to generate adventitious growth from the roots? Or is it too close to a building? There's a lot of factors to consider there, but generally, yes, I would think that natives would grow better, more naturally. But I can't confidently say that. I don't have enough experience to say that.
Okay, let's see. There was a question about using pruning seal products after pruning, which was answered in the chat. No, you don't want to use that. That can seal in disease.
Yeah, those were the Tree Care Industry Association which is basically the governing body. We no longer use any kind of sealants over a pruning wound because it impacts the ability for the coated principle to do its job.
Let's see. My crepe myrtle was planted in fall of 2020 and didn't bloom in 2021. I watered it through the drought and still no bloom. Any suggestions?
Okay, so a crepe myrtle is going to bloom off of new growth. I'm surprised that nothing happened. It might be, if it's a really small crepe, it might just be that it was because of that first season. It was trying to kind of, get itself set up and get structure, kind of settle in. If nothing happens this year, I don't know if you have a warranty on that tree. there's so many questions that I have. Like, I want to come see it and ask questions about, was it planted at the right depth? Did you do it yourself? Was it somebody else? There's too many things that I can't factor.
It was planted by by my landscaper, and he actually planted one with my neighbor too, and theirs bloomed and mine didn't. It's about probably a good 6 foot tall crepe myrtle.
Interesting. Yeah.
It had
you kept it watered and it's in a good place. I hope.
It's on the east side of my house, which gets a lot of sun in the morning, and it's it had some dead flowers on it when it was planted. I don't know if that makes any difference.
No, that shouldn't, because that's going to happen from season to season naturally. They don't all fall off completely. Yeah, I really don't know what to tell you about that, other than I would definitely if your landscaper is still somebody you work with, I would investigate. I mean, is it the same species that your neighbor had planted? Because there are so many cultivars and varieties of crepe myrtles that might be a factor.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Christine, that was a help desk question, and I think I basically told the client, I don't know if it was her, that to get in touch with an arborist.
Yeah, you could get a certified arborist out there too. That's not a bad plan. Anytime you can't discern the answer yourself, your best bet is going to be to ask a certified arborist, but most of them are going to want to see what you're talking about as opposed to giving you an answer over the phone.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. There's more of a comment, but it's kind of a question from Gary. I take over abandoned urban gardens and revitalize them. I've got seriously long abandoned fruit trees to trim and don't know what I'm doing.
Ooh. Fruit trees are a special breed all their own. The book, hang on one second. Let me see if I can get back to my presentation. Pruning and Training is a wonderful book, and it does address fruit trees very thoroughly. If these are seriously old, abandoned, like aging fruit trees, it may not be salvageable by pruning. It depends on what your goal is. Are you just trying to clean them up, or are you trying to get them to start producing again? There's a number of questions that need to be considered there, but if at the end of the presentation there was a note regarding pruning and training, that's a great book to check out. But I would consider having a certified arborist come out and look at those trees to help you decide what's worth the effort and what's not.
There's also I'm trying to think of who it is. There is a university professor who does some work with old fruit trees and has some YouTube videos. If I can think of it, I'll post it. I'll have Christina post it with the link for the video. Let's see, our next question. Whoops, where were we here? Young peach tree, main branches broken off and shipping, very tight V branches are left. Do I cut those away and hope that there will eventually be a tree with healthy limbs that grow out? Ooh, that's a tough one.
So if I'm understanding that question correctly, you received a peach tree that had no central leader. It was removed or damaged.
Sarah, are you still on? Can you answer that?
Regardless, if that central leader was taken out Either way, if you
sorry.
were, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was trying to find the mute button. It was damaged. Basically, it's like when I received it, it was almost like a thin slip of a tree. I'm not sure what you call those ones.
Okay.
But it had two other branches on it, but the two other ones were broken off. It's like they were just twigs.
Okay. So the only real branch structure is from lower down?
Yes.
Fruit trees, yeah, it is possible that you could try and train the highest branch that's left to become the central leader. If you have any kind of a warranty though, I would definitely try and go back to that. Because yeah, if it was damaged upon delivery, then hopefully you can get it replaced.
Yeah, the majority of the ones that I had ordered, that was like one of few that were actually alive. And I'm like, I'm not going to bother going back to them.
Fair enough.
So basically, I'm just trying to salvage what was still.
Yeah, I would make sure that you've got a clean cut down to that branch that you're going to try and use as your central leader. And you can work with guy wires to kind of try and help point it in that central direction. It's possible to do that, but it will be a challenge.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's see. Number next. What's the best way to prune a little gem magnolia branch that is on top of a tree? 5-year. There's a second question after that, but we'll start with that.
Little gem magnolia, and there's. I'm a little confused by that question.
I'm confused by two. It says little branch or little gem magnolia branch that is on the top of the tree.
What's the best way? Again, same, your basics are going to be involved there. As long as it's not the central leader that you're trying to take off, if it's just a branch up that's up really high, if it's out of your reach, I would suggest, calling in a professional certified arborist to handle that for you.
She says it was, Christine, she says it was damaged by snow.
Okay. Again, if it's within her reach, I would use the same concept of that 3-step. I would, cut it past the damage point, but far enough away from the trunk so that you can control it coming down the rest of the way and make that final cut outside of the branch collar. If it's outside of your reach and you have to stand on something to get that, please contact a professional certified arborist. I've seen and heard far too many horror stories about people being injured trying to make cuts off of ladders, etc.
Okay, 5-year-old red bud also split during the storm. They have a tear in the lower trunk that's almost 18 inches long. Is there anything that can help it heal?
Unlikely. You can do your best to clean up that cut, that rip, so that it doesn't have, protruding pieces of the tree sticking out that are going to limit its ability to wall off. That big of a wound, depending on the size of the tree, may be fatal, maybe not immediately. It might take a couple of years. Unfortunately, there's a fungal disease going around in the area that's impacting red buds. So I can't say for sure how well it's going to do without seeing it myself. But it sounds like a pretty significant wound that unfortunately I don't know that it's going to recover from. And there's really nothing else I can suggest except maybe attempting to clean up the area of the wound as much as possible.
Okay, are red buds considered native or non-native?
Oh, very native.
Okay, my arborvitaes are on the side of the house, are laying on the ground after the snow. The trunks do not appear broken. Can they recover by straightening them out and staking them?
If the root structure, like they haven't popped their root structure, like they didn't uproot, yes, it's possible. Arborvitaes they tend to be kind of flexible trees, but depending on the size, how long you've had them, you might consider replacement. It's really going to depend on how big they are. I mean, if we're talking 20-foot trees that are laying down and it doesn't appear that the trunk's broken, yeah, maybe they can come back up and you could use guy wires to hold them in place. Those guy wires can only stay in place for 1 year. Then they'll need to be removed. Otherwise, you're risking the tree trying to grow around them. But keep in mind that they are always going to be prone to that. I'm assuming it's from that first storm that we got. I had a magnolia take a really nasty hit in my yard, and it was the combination of the wind blowing the snow in the same place constantly. So all went over. Unfortunately, mine were breaks that I can see. So I'm going to wait until it's a little warmer before I try and make any adjustments to it. I would definitely contact a certified arborist and let them come out and help you make the judgment as to whether or not they can be salvaged. It's not something I can really judge without seeing it.
Okay, our next question is about blueberry bushes. This person has 3 large blueberry bushes on the edge of their yard, no maintenance for 25 years. How should I go about trimming it back for a more cultivated appearance and rejuvenate their fruit-bearing capacity? If you can't answer that, I can.
Go ahead, Thomas, all you.
Okay, so with blueberries, typically they bear fruit on young canes, usually less than 3 years old. So you've got a lot of canes there, or branches, if you will, that are drawing energy. On one hand, they're drawing energy. On the other hand, they're, photosynthesizing, but they're drawing energy. So that's not going into fruit production. I would look for the older wood and start trimming that out. Again, because you don't want to overstress the plants, I wouldn't do more than a third at a time. So I would start, and it may be a several-year process to get you to a point where you've totally reinvigorated it and you're doing well. The other option is you can cut it to the ground and let whatever comes up come up and then train it from there. I mean, if it's 25 years old, it probably has a really good root system, good stored energy. The issue would be that you'd want to do that before spring new growth is when you would want to make sure that you did that. Berry bushes are always a challenge when they're not pruned for a long time. But if you think they've got sufficient root stock, if they've been healthy for the last 25 years, they probably have enough stored energy where you could go all the way to the bottom and take a couple years rebuilding, quote unquote, letting the bushes redevelop. But if you want to take a more conservative approach, then I would do about a third at a time and pulling out that old wood. And that looks to be our last question.
Yeah, Thomas, I have one more question, if I might.
Sure.
So this is a sort of unusual question, but I had wrote a paper on how the meat industry affects our climate control. So then someone sent me an article that talked about how trees produce quite a bit of carbon as well, and also are affecting our climate control. My understanding was, because like even in the paper I wrote, it talked about how like in the Amazon rainforest, where they're cutting down these trees, the dead trees laying on the ground, yes, are producing carbon, but I have not heard anything about live trees producing significant carbon where it's affecting our climate control. Do you know anything about that?
As all living things respire, trees are going to give off carbon dioxide when they're resting. They give off a whole lot more when they are decaying, but generally trees are considered a carbon sink.
Yes.
And they are a positive for carbon sequestration instead of a negative.
Agreed.
Right, that's what I had thought. And like you said, if they're, the forest fires that we've been having, I guess that's putting off carbon. The huge amounts of trees cut down in the rainforest and laying on the ground, I guess those are creating carbon. But as far as our live trees and forests, they're helping the
Yes.
carbon issue, not hurting it.
Yes.
Agreed.
Okay,
And
thank you.
actually some of the best trees for pulling carbon out of the air are fast growing scrub pines because they grow so fast and they pull a lot of carbon out every year. But yeah, live trees are definitely helping the situation rather than causing part of a problem.
Okay, thank you.
So, oh wow, just looking at the time.
Yeah, about that time.
Hey,
Again,
Thomas,
yes.
can you tell them where it'll be posted? Someone wants to know it. I've started to write it, but I don't have the link.
Sure. Let me pull that link for our YouTube channel. I will try and get this up on the YouTube channel by the end of the week. Oops, let me get it there. And it will have the recording with Christina as well, or Christine's practical video attached to it. I also would remind you that Christina is going to send out an evaluation. Please fill that out. It helps us be responsive to our stakeholders, particularly the state and the county. If you enjoy this program, in 2 weeks on the 9th, we're going to have a class on propagation. And then 2 weeks after that, one on annuals. And then we're going to have a class on trees starting March 2nd. And that will start us back on a weekly rotation instead of every 2 weeks as we've done over the winter.
Thomas, there was one question that I saw that I don't think you had Christine answer. And that was someone had asked, like after you make a prune, you can buy the stuff that you paint over top of the cut.
Grant, I did answer it and I told him no.
That was answered.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And that is the correct answer. Don't use anything to paint the wounds. It limits the ability of the tree to use the coated principle and heal itself.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Exactly. Well, thank you everybody for sticking around, and we hope you have a good rest of your week. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks for propagation. Thank you very much, Christine, for presenting.
No problem. Thanks, guys, for listening. I hope it was helpful. Have a great day.
Hi, I'm Christine Huseman, and I'm going to be showing you some pruning techniques today. But before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about pruning. Pruning is the selective removal of plant parts to manage plant health and growth. We do this to make sure that the plants remain healthy as things break, and to maintain clearance for individuals and traffic. Depends on where the tree is or where the bush is and what your goals are. So when you're pruning, something to keep in mind, actually the primary thing to keep in mind is going to be the species that you're dealing with. You need to understand what your species is in order to be able to follow the science and the biology of the plant to prune it correctly. When you prune is going to be also determined by what that plant is. Plants that flower in the from before June, those flower off of older growth, so you want to wait and prune those after they have bloomed. Plants that bloom June or say July, August, later in the summer, those you want to prune in the dormant season, which is now. But you want to make sure that you're timing it correctly, and that's what we're going to be considering today. Tomorrow's weather is forecasted to be freezing rain, so you don't want to be opening wounds on a tree, because that's what you are doing when you prune, is you are effectively wounding the tree or the woody perennial. So we're only going to be doing deadwood pruning today or damaged pruning today. So before we get started, we should go over some tools and some safety. Safety is always going to be your priority whenever you are working with trees, pruning, especially if you're using a saw. You want to make sure that you have on safety glasses to protect your eyes. There are a variety of options out there, clear and shaded. It just depends on your preference. For your hands, you always want to have on a pair of gloves. I choose to wear gauntlet gloves because I have allergies, so it gives me extra protection over my wrist. And that way I don't have to worry if I'm getting into a tree that has any type of vines in it, because sometimes that happens. Tool-wise, you want to make sure that you are using good judgment when you're picking your tools. For hand pruners, you want to make sure that you are using a bypass pruner. It does not need to be anything fancy. There's a number of different options available, but make sure that it is a bypass pruner. An anvil pruner is going to crush your branch, whereas a bypass is going to make a nice clean cut. You also want to make sure that you maintain your tools, sharpen them, oil them, clean them after you use them, especially if you're working with diseased trees. Because diseased trees are going to spread potentially by your pruner, depending on the disease. In terms of thinking about the size, you want to be using your hand pruners for anything that is pinky size or smaller. Once you get anything larger than that in terms of your branch diameter, you really need to step up to the next level of tool in order to make sure that you're making a clean cut. Otherwise, you're going to be forcing it too hard if you're using the smaller tool. What we have available then is you have an option of a compound pruner, which again is a bypass. Some of them are extendable, just depends on what you want and what you feel is needed for your property. This is an optional saw as well for using, for cutting girdling roots and things that are not a finished cut. Dead wood you could use it on, but I still prefer to use a handsaw, and there's a number of options available there as well. I like a straight blade, but you can get a curved blade if that's more your preference. You need to figure out what's most comfortable for you. There's also collapsible, so they're a little bit easier to carry around with you. The benefit to most saws is that the blades are replaceable. So you notice the screw heads, you can get new blades for them, and that way they will be around for life. So if you feel that you need to use a chainsaw because none of these tools are appropriate, please make sure that you are comfortable using it and use it as safely as possible. Make sure that you get yourself some form of ear protection so that you are not going to be damaging your eardrums while using the equipment. Make sure that you are not using it above your head. If you are using it above your head, you really need to consult a certified arborist. You can do so by checking the website of goodtreecare.com. That's goodtreecare.com. Also, if you're using a chainsaw, make sure you're wearing safety chaps to protect your legs. And again, make sure that you consider whether or not it's something that you should be managing as a homeowner. The professionals, certified arborists, are there for a reason. So when pruning, you want to follow a few rules. And one of the basic rules is the 4 Ds. You want to remove in order any dead wood, any damaged wood, any diseased wood, or any, as I affectionately call it, deranged wood, which means conflicting or crossing limbs. Here's a great example of that. These 2 limbs, as you can see, are touching, and over time they're going to rub and they're going to cause damage. They're going to allow pest or disease in, and they may eventually combine. What you need to do is decide which branch is going to be the most beneficial to remove. And as I'm looking farther up into this is the branch that I would remove here, because it's going even further up and conflicting further up as well. And if you come in down here, you can see the branch collar, and you would make a cut, your final cut, right here. So it's coming just outside that branch collar and down towards the bottom here, but not actually taking out any of that branch ridge. So we talked about the 4 Ds, and we're going to show you a little bit more about that here. First was dead wood, second was damaged wood, then diseased wood, and of course the deranged wood. Here we have a good example of damaged wood. This probably broke in the most recent storm. Actually, it might have broken a little bit farther back based on what I'm seeing up in there, but I can't be positive. But what we're going to do today is we're going to remove this, because you can remove dead wood or damaged wood anytime, because it's in the best interest of the tree to remove it as soon as practical. In terms of doing your pruning in the winter, you do want to consider your weather. If you're doing any work on diseased or just aesthetic pruning for clearance, for helping to train something, when you're pruning in the wintertime, you want to think about the weather. If it's going to be extremely cold right after you prune, or if you've got snow, or as forecast here, freezing rain coming in, wait. The best gauge here in this area has generally been to wait until between February 14th and March 15th to do your pruning for your dormant season before early spring. But please keep an eye out, because the weather has been changing and some seasons have been longer, wetter, weirder. You got to pay attention. Okay, now we're going to demonstrate a 3-point cut to remove this damaged branch. The 3-point cut is designed to help protect the tree as you're removing any wood. If you start by making your upper cut before you've done any type of cut to the bottom, as the tree starts to detach, or the branch starts to detach, it's going to pull down and potentially rip the bark back through the branch ridge and through the branch collar. It's imperative that you don't damage these, because these are part of coated, which is the compartmentalization of decay in trees. There are 4 walls to this system. 3 of them are internal, but this is the most important one, the exterior 4th wall, that you don't want to damage. So while we're at it, we're going to talk a little bit about shrubs. Woody perennials are going to be treated the same way that you would treat a tree. You want to make sure that you're making good, clean cuts every time. It's imperative that you do that, because if you make a so-so cut in one place but do good cuts everywhere else, you might still invite in disease or pests. So make sure that you're thorough every time. What we're looking at today is some boxwoods, and as you can see, these over here are snow covered and they've collapsed. And this is due to the over density at the tops, with nothing in between growing to help support and stabilize the plant. We have done some work on these boxwoods in the past to try and start opening them up. And as you can see, the two up front are still standing because of that, because we took out some of that heavyweight crown. The next steps in pruning these would be to start opening them up through the fronts so that we can start to see light coming all the way through the plant, so that some of these interior stubs and stems will be able to start generating growth from meristems that are embedded within the stalks themselves or the stems themselves. I hesitate to do too much pruning on this today because of the weather that's coming in, but I will show you at least one cut based on everything that I see in here. Like I said, I really want to try and open it up so that I can start seeing a little bit of light through. Ready?
Yep.
So we're going to try and take out something a little bit down low here. And because this is so dense, I'm actually going to take a pretty significant cut. It's probably hard to see at the moment, but down in the base here, there is my spot where I want to make my cut. So I'm going to shake the snow off, and I'm going to try and get in there as deep down as I can and make a nice clean cut right to the base. Not quite in there.